Hi, welcome to How to RPG. My name is Fred Weller, and today I want to talk about dungeons and dungeon design, which is the torture chamber. And I have collected as much information as I possibly can. I'm going to go over that with you, and so you've got something to work with. So the first thing I noticed with torture chambers is when you look on the internet, there's not that much information. And if you look on YouTube, it really doesn't give you what you're looking for if you're running a role-playing game. And so I want to try to correct that problem for you by doing this particular presentation today. So first off, torture chambers are made up of 3 different locations, and that is your prison, your torture area, and your execution area. Now, most torture chambers, or dungeons as they might be called, okay, if you think outside of Dungeons and Dragons in terms of a dungeon, I'm talking about a real dungeon that is used for that purpose for a prison, torturing and execution, say underneath the castle or somewhere else. They're very small. They occupy a very small space normally, but they could consist of separate chambers if the dungeon's very large. And there were large dungeons in medieval times, so you could have a large dungeon in your game. Prison cells can be anything from a deep hole with a cover over it. It could be a wooden cover, it could be an iron grate. You would also have wooden or iron cages to hold people. You might use a crow's cage, which was basically just a cage that would hold a person, and it would hang from a tree or a big stay, some sort of gallows section. They would hang it from all sorts of things. But if you had a large enough area, you could also suspend the crow's cage, this iron cage that would hold somebody in a dungeon if the ceiling was quite high. So often you would have the high wooden scaffold that would hold the crow's cage, but for a dungeon area, it's only going to apply if the ceiling is quite high. And the reason you would do this is to keep them off the ground and make it harder for them to escape, but also to save space. Now, criminals were imprisoned inside the crow's cage without food or water until they died of dehydration and starvation, which is a horrible way to die. And certainly this is one way of torture, but also execution, just long form execution. Now this one is a bit of a tricky one to say. It's not the gibbet. It is the gibbet, isn't it? It's the gibbet. I think it's gibbet. Gibbet. It is an instrument for public execution normally, or a gallows, and it would hang a person in a wire frame moulded around their body. It looked quite strange. It was not like the crow's cage. It was different. More often, the gibbet is erected outside, but could be used inside a dungeon, because they used to use normal forms of hanging from a noose with a rope inside a dungeon. So you could use a gibbet as well if you wanted to. The strapedo. Now, the strapedo was a simple rope or series of ropes and pulley system with the pulleys attached to the ceiling of the chamber, and the lifting ropes would be tied to the wrists of the victim, whose hands would then be tied behind their back. So it would be positioned in such a way as they would be behind your back and they would lift it up. And the strapedo would pull the shoulders out of their joints, causing extreme pain, and they would hang there for large periods of time, possibly till they died, but also until they revealed the information that was being held by them. Now, you'll notice that a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is the kinds of torture equipment that you would find inside a torture chamber. And I thought that would be really useful to you. There's quite a few items. I'm not going to go over absolutely everything, but I'll do my best. The Iron Maiden was an iron coffin featuring a sort of mallard face on it, and you would put a poor victim inside. Okay, they would be thrown inside, and then it would have folding hinges in the front, and it would fold onto them. They would often have iron spikes positioned inside the coffin that would point inward, that would pierce their skin, causing them to bleed slowly. And of course, they would have blood loss occurring, and of course, eventually they would die if they would stay in there without some sort of medical treatment. But The Iron Maiden did not always have spikes on the inside. Sometimes it was just spikeless. There was a design that required no spikes on the inside. It was still called the Iron Maiden, and the reason for using it is people get claustrophobic. It's very uncomfortable being locked in a position where you're standing and you can't breathe very well, so it's still another form of torture, and you could be left there for a long time. They could also heat the Iron Maiden, which is quite a horrible prospect as well. The wooden horse, or charvalet, I think it's also called the Spanish donkey. It has another name which I cannot pronounce. This torture device had two variations that existed. Both inflicted pain by using the subject's own weight by keeping their legs open, so they would spread their legs open, and they would be tied with ropes from above while they were lowered down onto this horse. And the horse shape, the wooden horse shape, it could be made out of metal, but often it was a wooden horse. It was shaped like a sharp triangular box, and this meant that it would apply the point of that triangle would apply pressure to their buttocks and to their genitals, which is extremely unpleasant. So that's another type of torture device you would find inside the torture chamber. You have the guillotine. Now, the guillotine was usually used for outdoor displays, an instrument for inflicting capital punishment by decapitation, which is removing the head. So a guillotine used a sharp, wide, heavy blade, and it would be dropped from the top of a frame vertically in grooves onto somebody's head who would be placed inside the frame. This is not so much torture, this is execution. The rack torture device is gruesome, and basically the idea was the individual's joints would be dislocated or torn from their sockets. They would actually be maimed, okay? You would lose limbs. And this would cause, in some cases, paralyzation for the rest of their life if they survived the process and didn't wind up getting executed anyway. And so basically your torture rack is a table. It didn't necessarily have to be a complete normal table. It might have just ribs to it, and it would have a system of cranks attached to ropes, and those ropes would be tied to the victim's limbs, and they would be stretched. It's actually very effective, and unfortunately they didn't have to apply very much pressure to do a lot of damage. Next, you have the iron chair. The victim, and this is basically an iron chair, and the victim would be seated in several straps or plates made out of brass, and then placed over an open flame. They would actually roast them while they were sitting in this iron chair. And yes, being slowly roasted alive doesn't sound very pleasant. There were a few variations of the iron chair that included small spikes that would go up into the buttocks. And yeah, you don't want to be dealing with that one. The pillory, basically, this device is basically either made out of wood or metal. It's a framework erected on a post, and it was usually employed for displays in public. It had holes in it. It would secure your head and your hands, and it was a form of punishment primarily for humiliating people in public, but it could also be used to secure somebody in a torture chamber or in a prison, rather than using manacles or ropes. But of course, the good thing about the pillory is that you could further abuse somebody because they could not get away, they could not avoid stuff, they couldn't move their head, their hands, their body. They were secured pretty well. Another one, and you may not have heard of this before, and that is the cat's paw. Was a three-pronged device. It kind of looks like a claw. Think Wolverine's claws, but kind of bent over. And it would be used to shred human flesh and cause all sorts of gouging and marks and lines. So it's not a very nice tool, but it was certainly out there. Prisoners would be forced to wear a head cage. The head cage, sometimes you might think of the man in the iron mask, but often the head cage would be literally a cage. You could see through it. You could see the person's head back and front. It had lots of gaps in it, but it was basically a cage. Now, the reason for doing that was it would lock the head in place so the jailers could torture them in a variety of different ways. It just made it easier to control where their head would go. Thumb screws. Thumb screws is a torture instrument, been around a long time, first employed by modern Europe, and they're basically designed to crush the thumbs and the forefinger. not a particularly nice way to go. If you've ever dislocated your thumb or your fingers before, you'll know how painful it is. The tiger's chair. This is a steel chair that had affixed iron legs and handcuffs that restrained the body, often in painful positions. So it wouldn't just seat you normally, you would be positioned in such a way that you did not want to be in that position, and you would be held there, fixed by these handcuffs indefinitely for however long they decided to leave you there. Then we have our manacles and our ropes that were used to secure your prisoners to the walls, to their equipment, or to a cage, or just for transport. The iron bull is not that common. You didn't necessarily see an iron bull being dragged by somebody with manacles or chains around them, but we see a lot of that stuff in movies, don't we? Next we have a rather horrible piece of equipment, and that is the bronze or brazen bull. And basically it was a hollowed out metal bull, quite often made out of bronze, and they would open up the bronze bull, put the victim inside because there was a cavity inside it. They would lock them inside, and then they would put them over an open flame and heat the bull until basically they cooked. And so you could use that for torture, but also for execution potentially. I'm sure a few people died accidentally. The next one is quite strange, and this is the breaking wheel, or just called the wheel. And this is basically exactly what it sounds like, because it had spokes on it, and it would be dropped onto your limbs to break bones. And essentially it's the wheel slightly modified that would come off a wagon. So the old wagon wheel, the wooden wagon wheel with the metal straps and stuff like that, they would just simply take one of those, modify it, and then use it for just dropping on somebody. Because it was so heavy, it would do a lot of damage. The branding hot irons also, lots of irons and tongs were used in terms of torture. And then the one thing that you probably want to consider too, which is kind of weird, is that even in the medieval times, the torture chamber was designed acoustically to muffle the sound of screaming and noise, because a lot of noise would come from a torture area, and you didn't want to put off everybody from eating their dinner, even though you would probably lower in the castle location, or your dungeon was set off from everywhere else. You wanted to sort of muffle those sounds so that people didn't have to hear all those horrible noises as people went to their business and or was executed. Like, all of this is quite horrible when you think about what people will do, but I'm not suggesting that you include torture into your role-playing games, but I am aware that when you put your dungeons together, there is a temptation quite often to put in a torture area, or a prison area, or an execution area. So now these are the devices that you can include in those locations to make it a bit more authentic, and hopefully scare people a little bit, but hopefully not too much. I want to thank my patrons who support me so I can keep doing this program. I want to thank you for watching, and hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.